The argument here is not that Family Guy's decline was some unavoidable consequence of running for over 20 seasons. It was the direct result of specific creative decisions that hollowed out everything that made the show great in the first place. The characters were stripped of the traits that made them lovable and rebuilt into meaner, flatter versions of themselves. The cutaway gags went from being a clever bonus to becoming a crutch that replaced actual storytelling. The humor shifted from sharp, intelligent comedy to lazy shock value. And the man who created the whole thing quietly stepped away from the wheel, leaving his greatest creation in the hands of people who did not protect it the way he would have. Season by season, choice by choice, Family Guy went from being one of the most beloved animated comedies of all time to becoming the clearest example of what happens when a show stops caring about being good and just settles for being profitable. The first section covers the golden years and what made Family Guy great in seasons 1 through 3. To understand why Family Guy gets worse every season, you first have to understand what made it so good in the first place. Because the show that exists today and the show that started back in 1999 are almost two completely different things. The characters are different, the humor is different, the heart is different, and the only way to see just how far this show has fallen is to go back to the very beginning and look at what the creators got right when they actually cared about getting it right. Family Guy was created by Seth MacFarlane. Before the show ever existed, MacFarlane was a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. After graduating, he worked on children's programs at Hanna-Barbera, contributing to shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. During that time, he produced 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a character named Larry and his dog Steve, and if you watch them, you can tell immediately that these two would eventually become Peter and Brian Griffin. MacFarlane took those characters, developed them further, built a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox gave him the green light, and Family Guy was born. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. That is one of the best time slots on television because millions of people are already watching. The first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers, which was a massive number. The show was set in a fictional town called Quahog, Rhode Island, and it followed the Griffin family. Peter was the overweight, not particularly intelligent father. Lois was his wife, a stay-at-home mother who played piano and generally tried to prevent Peter from doing something catastrophic. Their daughter Meg was a regular, unpopular teenager. Their son Chris was awkward and somewhat oblivious. Their baby Stewie was secretly an evil genius bent on world domination and the murder of his own mother. And Brian was the family dog who could talk, enjoyed martinis, and was honestly the most capable member of the household. What made this setup work so well in those early seasons was that every character had a clear role, and they balanced each other out. Peter was foolish, but he meant well. He loved his family even when he was doing something completely idiotic. There is a meaningful difference between a character who does stupid things because he is a lovable fool, and a character who does cruel things because the writers think cruelty is funny. In seasons 1 through 3, Peter was the first one. He was a working-class father who drank beer with his friends at the bar, got into ridiculous situations, and came home at the end of the day and told Lois he loved her. He was not a genius, he was not a good decision-maker, but he was not a bad person, and that balance is what made him simultaneously funny and likable. Brian served as the voice of reason in those early seasons. He was smart, widely read, and had a dry, sarcastic quality that made him the ideal counterbalance to Peter's loud stupidity. Their dynamic was one of the best parts of the show. Brian would try to talk sense into Peter, Peter would ignore him, things would go wrong, and Brian would be there to help clean up the mess. Brian also had his own storylines. He was a failed writer who wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual. He had quietly complicated feelings for Lois. He drank a little too much. These traits made him feel like a fully realized character with genuine depth. He was not perfect, and that was the point. He felt like someone you could actually know. Then there was Stewie, who in those first 3 seasons was one of the most original characters on television. He was a baby, barely 1 year old, but he spoke like a Bond villain. He built weapons in his bedroom. He constructed machines. His primary objectives were world domination and the elimination of his mother Lois. Almost every episode included some moment where Stewie was working on a new scheme or building some device to advance his goals. The humor came from the contrast. A tiny baby in a diaper, sitting in a high chair, eating baby food, while calmly discussing his plans to enslave humanity. The gap between what he looked like and what he was saying never got old because the writers kept finding new and inventive ways to play with that contrast. The humor in seasons 1 through 3 was also different from what the show would later become. Yes, Family Guy always had cutaway gags. A character would say something, the screen would cut to a short joke or random scene, and then return to the main story. But in the early seasons, those cutaways were shorter, sharper, and they did not take over the episode. They were a bonus on top of an already solid story. The episodes had real plots with beginnings, middles, and endings. The cutaways added something extra without replacing the actual writing. More importantly, the early show had heart. The Griffins were a chaotic family, but underneath all of it, they loved each other. Episodes ended with Peter and Lois making up after an argument. Peter would do something foolish, recognize he was wrong, and actually try to fix things. Even Meg, who would later become the target of some of the worst sustained cruelty in cartoon history, was just a normal teenage girl in these first 3 seasons. She was unpopular at school, somewhat overlooked by her family, but her family did not despise her. The worst Meg got in the early days was being treated as the least interesting person in the room, which is a pretty relatable experience for a lot of teenagers. The show also had a strong team behind it. MacFarlane himself was deeply involved in every part of the program. He was not just the creator and the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was hands-on with the writing, the animation direction, and the overall creative vision. When you watch those early episodes, you can feel that someone who cared about the show was steering it. There was a clear point of view, a specific sense of humor, and nothing felt random or lazy. After a strong first season, things became difficult for the show, not because of quality, but because of Fox. During its second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, placing it directly against Frasier on NBC. The ratings dropped. Fox then moved it to Tuesday nights, where it competed unsuccessfully against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Fox kept shuffling the show between days and time slots with very little notice, and the audience had trouble keeping up. By the end of the 3rd season in 2002, Fox officially canceled Family Guy. But something happened that nobody expected. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on their Adult Swim programming block, and they obtained those rights for almost nothing because nobody thought the show had much remaining value. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003, and almost immediately, Family Guy became the most watched program on the entire block. It dominated late-night viewing and boosted Adult Swim's viewership by 239%. At the same time, DVD sets of the first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies in short order. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show and telling their friends about it. This combination of massive Adult Swim ratings and strong DVD sales caught Fox's attention. In 2004, Fox ordered new episodes, and committed to bringing the show back. Fans were thrilled. When a show gets canceled, it almost always stays canceled. Family Guy had proven that its audience was loyal and passionate enough to bring it back from the dead. And that is where things get complicated, because the show that returned in 2005 was not quite the same show that had left in 2002. The second section covers the resurrection and the shift in seasons 4 and 5. When Family Guy came back from cancellation in 2005, it was one of the biggest television events in years. Not because of awards or prestige, but because what happened to it almost never happens to any show. Getting canceled once is usually the end. Getting canceled twice is supposed to be permanent. But Family Guy did not just survive 2 cancellations. It returned to Fox's Sunday night lineup as part of the newly assembled animation domination block, airing alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new McFarlane creation called American Dad. Fox had bet heavily on bringing the show back, and audiences responded. The first thing you notice about Season 4 is that it looks different. In the original 3 seasons, the show had a rougher, more hand-drawn quality. The characters moved in a looser, more natural way. When the show came back for Season 4, the animation was cleaner and smoother, but also stiffer. The outlines were thicker, the movements more restricted, and the overall look felt more polished, but less alive. Animation style matters enormously in a cartoon. It affects how jokes land, how characters express themselves, and how the whole show feels. The early seasons had a scrappy, handmade quality that matched the humor. The new look was slicker, but something had been lost in the polish. The writing was different too, and the reason was straightforward. When a show gets canceled, the writers move on to other projects. You cannot expect a creative team to sit around for 3 years waiting for a program that might never return. McFarlane acknowledged this directly when he said that one consequence of Family Guy constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to bring in new writers. So when the show returned in 2005, it was not the same writing room that had crafted those beloved first 3 seasons. Some of the original writers were gone. New people had been hired, and different people bring different sensibilities to the table. One of the most noticeable changes in Season 4 was what happened to the cutaway gags. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways were part of the show, but did not dominate it. They were seasoning on a meal, a little extra flavor added here and there. Starting in Season 4, cutaways became more frequent, longer, and more central to the comedy. Episodes began leaning on them more heavily. Instead of being a bonus on top of a good story, they started to feel like the main attraction, with the actual plot becoming little more than connective tissue between one gag and the next. To be fair, many of these cutaways were still genuinely funny. Some of the most iconic Family Guy clips on the internet come from this era. These self-contained little sketches were perfectly suited to the rise of video-sharing websites. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned, and fans could clip out a 30-second cutaway and share it with millions of people. But there is a meaningful difference between a show that creates great moments and a show that tells great stories, and Family Guy was slowly starting to become more about the moments. Season 4 also brought subtle changes to the characters. Peter was still mostly likable, still the dumb but endearing father who got into trouble and usually absorbed some kind of lesson by the end. But there were moments where his stupidity was pushed slightly further than before. In the original seasons, Peter was foolish in a way that felt grounded. He made bad decisions because he did not think things through, not because he was incapable of basic human reasoning. Starting in Season 4, his intelligence began to drop more noticeably, and the show did not always hold him accountable the way the earlier seasons had. Brian was still mostly the voice of reason in Season 4, but his liberal political views, which had always been one part of a complex character, started to claim more of the available space. It was not overwhelming yet, but you could feel it building. The character who used to be the grounded, sarcastic heart of the show was beginning to transform into something narrower. Stewie's transformation was more obvious. The writers had come to feel that the evil baby concept was running out of room. They had taken the joke as far as they thought it could go, so starting in season 4, they began moving Stewie away from his villainous personality. The world domination plots became less frequent. The attempts to kill Lois slowed down. Stewie started showing more of his emotional side, developing closer bonds with Brian, and becoming involved in storylines about his personal insecurities and identity rather than his elaborate schemes. Some of this worked. The developing friendship between Stewie and Brian became one of the most popular elements of the show. Their dynamic was genuinely entertaining, an odd couple pairing where two very different personalities genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But the trade-off was real. There are hundreds of cartoon characters who are funny sidekicks or quirky best friends. There was only one evil genius baby who wanted to murder his mother and conquer the planet. That character was being quietly retired, and nothing quite as original was taking his place. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued the trends that Season 4 had started. The cutaways kept growing, the characters kept shifting. But this season also produced some episodes that are genuinely considered among the best the show ever made. Road to Rupert, featuring Brian and Stewie on one of their road trip adventures, was a standout. Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of sympathy, showed that the show could still deliver sharp, character-driven comedy when it committed to the idea. Season 5 also had a problem that would only intensify over time. The treatment of Meg Griffin began to escalate. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was just the boring, unpopular teenager. The joke was that she was the least interesting member of an otherwise extraordinary family. Starting in Season 4 and getting noticeably worse in Season 5, the jokes about Meg shifted from her being overlooked to her being ugly, unwanted, and deserving of contempt. The seeds were being planted for something that would eventually become one of the most uncomfortable running elements in the show's entire history. The warmth that had characterized the Griffin family in the early seasons was also cooling. Peter and Lois fought more, and not in the playful way they used to. The moments of genuine affection that used to close out episodes became less common. If you watched a Season 1 episode and then jumped directly to a Season 5 episode, you would feel the difference immediately. The family that used to stick together, no matter what, was slowly becoming a family that seemed annoyed by each other's existence. Despite all of this, Seasons 4 and 5 are still generally considered solid television. The writing, while different, was sharp enough to produce memorable episodes. The characters, while shifting, still retained enough of their original personalities to be enjoyable. If the show had stayed at this level, Family Guy would probably be remembered very differently than it is today. It did not stay at this level. The third section covers the tipping point, Seasons 6 and 7, where the cracks become breaks. If Seasons 4 and 5 were the period where you could sense something changing but could not quite name it, Seasons 6 and 7 are where the changes become impossible to ignore. These 2 seasons are the bridge between the Family Guy that people fell in love with and the Family Guy that people started to fall out of love with. The problems that were small and manageable in Seasons 4 and 5 began growing faster during this stretch, and a real-world event completely outside the show's control made everything worse. Season 6 premiered in September of 2007, and right away, fans noticed the animation had changed again. The later portion of Season 6 and into Season 7 was handled by a studio called Digital Animation, and the result brought yet another shift in look. The outlines on the characters became flatter, the movement more rigid compared to earlier seasons. The overall visual quality was competent, but lacked the energy that had made the early seasons feel alive. Comedy depends enormously on timing, expression, and movement. when the animation feels like a machine is producing it, rather than people who are excited about what they are creating, the comedy suffers in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Season 6 featured one of the most ambitious storylines the show had ever attempted. The two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie called back to everything that made early Stewie so compelling. In the first part, Stewie apparently follows through on his lifelong goal and kills Lois. In the second, Lois turns out to be alive and returns for revenge. These episodes were exciting, dramatic, and darkly funny. Fans loved them. They are often cited as some of the last truly ambitious episodes the show produced. But here's the thing about that two-parter. It ended with a twist revealing that the entire story was just a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. Everything snapped back to normal. And while that twist was clever in the moment, it also said something important about where the show was headed. Family Guy was becoming a program that could not commit to real consequences. Big things could happen, characters could change, the status quo could be upended, but by the end of the episode, everything would return to exactly where it had been before. When a show does this repeatedly, the audience stops being invested in what happens because they know none of it will matter. Then came the event that disrupted not just Family Guy, but the entire television industry. In November of 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. Thousands of television and film writers refused to work because they were fighting for better pay, particularly regarding money from DVD sales and digital distribution. The strike lasted roughly 3 months, from November 2007 to February 2008, and it halted nearly every scripted program on television. MacFarlane was a strong supporter of the writers and joined the picket lines. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 Family Guy episodes without his permission. These were episodes that had been completed before the strike began, so Fox technically had the right to broadcast them, but airing them against the creators' wishes left a lasting bad feeling. It was an early sign of the tension between MacFarlane and Fox that would continue to grow in the years ahead. When the strike ended in February 2008, Family Guy resumed production. But the disruption had consequences. Television writers work on tight schedules, planning stories weeks and months in advance. When that process is interrupted for 3 months, you cannot simply pick up where you left off. The rhythm gets broken, and recovering it takes time. Season 7, which aired from 2008 to 2009, continued the trends that had been developing since the revival. The humor was leaning more heavily on shock value. In seasons 1 through 3, dark humor came from clever setups and unexpected punchlines. A joke might be offensive, but it was also well crafted. It had layers. By season 7, more and more of the humor came simply from showing something extreme and hoping the audience would react. The show was starting to confuse being shocking with being funny, and those are not the same thing. The characters were also becoming less consistent. Peter's behavior grew more extreme from episode to episode. Brian's political soapboxing was becoming more visible, with entire scenes devoted to him expressing views that felt less like natural dialogue and more like the writers using him as a stand-in for their own opinions. Lois, who had been the patient and reasonable counterpoint in the early seasons, was starting to seem colder and more detached. Meg's treatment continued to escalate. Season 7 also gave early glimpses of what would become one of the show's worst later habits, the tendency to drag jokes far past the point where they were funny. In the early seasons, if a cutaway or a gag did not land, it was over in a few seconds, and the show moved on. Around this period, the writers began stretching jokes for uncomfortably long periods. A gag that should have lasted 5 seconds would continue for 30. A scene that made its point in 10 seconds would run for a full minute. When you cannot generate enough strong material to fill an episode, one option is to make each joke take longer. It fills the time, but it does not fill it well. Despite everything, seasons 6 and 7 were not terrible. For every episode that felt tired or mean-spirited, there was another with flashes of the old quality. The road trip episodes featuring Brian and Stewie remained reliably entertaining. Individual jokes and scenes appeared that were as sharp as anything the show had ever produced. The voice cast was still performing at a high level. The talent in front of the microphone was never the problem. The problem was what was being written for them to say. Looking back now, seasons 6 and 7 were not a rough patch. They were the beginning of a long decline. The changes that were subtle here would become extreme in the seasons that followed. The fourth section is about the Flanderization of Peter Griffin. There is a word that gets used frequently when people discuss long-running television shows, and that word is Flanderization. It comes from a character on The Simpsons named Ned Flanders. In the early seasons of that show, Ned was a friendly, religious neighbor with many different qualities. He was kind, he was a good father, he was patient with Homer, and his faith was just one component of a complex character. But as the years went on, the writers stripped away everything else about Ned until his entire personality was compressed into a single extreme trait. That is Flanderization. It is when a character who was once multidimensional gets reduced to one or two exaggerated features until they barely resemble who they were at the start. Family Guy may be the single worst example of Flanderization in the history of animated television. And no character was hit harder by it than Peter Griffin. The transformation of Peter from the lovable, dim-witted father of seasons 1 through 3 into the cruel, erratic, borderline dangerous version that exists from season 8 onward is one of the most dramatic character collapses any show has ever produced. It did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, piece by piece, season by season, until one day you looked at Peter and realized the character on screen had almost nothing in common with the one you had originally connected with. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was a simple man. He was overweight, not very intelligent, and worked at a toy factory before eventually taking a job at a local brewery. He loved beer, he loved watching television, he loved spending time with his friends at the Drunken Clam. He made terrible decisions constantly. But here is the key thing that made early Peter work as a character. He meant well underneath all the foolishness. He loved Lois. He loved his kids. When he messed things up, which was constantly, he would recognize it by the end of the episode and try to make it right. He would apologize. He would admit he was wrong. He would hug his wife and acknowledge that he had been an idiot. That cycle of failing, recognizing the failure, and trying to repair things is what made Peter relatable despite his many obvious flaws. He was not a bad person. He was a good person who happened to be genuinely, spectacularly foolish. Compare that to the Peter Griffin of season 8 and beyond. Starting around that point, the writers pushed Peter's foolishness to levels that went far past anything from the early years. It was no longer that Peter made bad decisions because he failed to think things through. Now, Peter seemed to lack basic human comprehension altogether, to the point where it became difficult to believe he could function in society at all. But the larger problem was not simply that Peter got more foolish. It was that he got meaner. The lovable idiot who used to feel genuine remorse about hurting people became a character who seemed either to enjoy causing harm or to have no interest at all in the consequences of his actions. In one episode, Peter and Lois are on a boat when Peter sees what he thinks is a shark approaching. His response is to shove Lois underwater and flee in the boat, abandoning his own wife to what he believes is certain death. It turns out to be a dolphin, but that does not change what Peter did. He pushed his wife beneath the water and ran. The Peter from season 1 could not have done this. That Peter loved Lois. He would have tried to protect her even if his method was clumsy and ineffective. The later Peter does not hesitate. He throws her under and escapes. The examples accumulate. Peter steals Stewie's Halloween candy, a grown man taking treats from his own baby. He manipulates his friend Joe into damaging his marriage. He gets Brian fired from a job out of jealousy. These are not the actions of a lovable fool. These are the actions of a selfish, indifferent person who does not consider the people around him as worthy of any real regard. The physical violence also escalated dramatically. In the early seasons, the show featured cartoon violence in the way most animated comedies do. Characters got hurt in silly, exaggerated ways and were fine in the next scene. Standard animation fare that nobody found troubling. But in the later seasons, the violence became considerably more graphic and more disturbing. Peter appeared in scenes where people suffered injuries drawn with enough specificity to feel more uncomfortable than funny, and the show expected the audience to laugh regardless. One of the most telling moments in the entire series arrives in the season 10-episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In this episode, Meg finally snaps and confronts her family about how they have been treating her. She turns to Peter and delivers a speech that accurately catalogs who he has become. She calls him completely selfish and irresponsible. She says he has no genuine interests and simply does whatever reckless thing he wants without considering anyone else. She tells him that if someone outside the family could see how he treats her, he would be in jail. Everything Meg says is true. It is not exaggeration. It is not dramatic license. Every single thing she describes is something Peter has actually done on the show. And Peter's response to this speech tells you everything about what his character has become. He laughs. He finds it amusing. He registers no guilt, no shame, no sadness. The early Peter would have been genuinely hurt by those words. He might not have fully understood them, but he would have felt something. The later Peter feels nothing. Peter's relationship with his children suffered across the board, but his treatment of Meg became the most extreme example. But the following episode, everything resets. Peter is back to treating Meg with contempt, as if the reconciliation never happened. This is the central problem with a show that refuses to let its characters grow. You can write a touching episode where a character learns something meaningful, but if that lesson evaporates by next week, it meant nothing. It was a one-off designed to make the audience feel something before returning immediately to the established status quo. Peter's friendships also changed in ways that reflected his overall decline. In the early seasons, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland were a tight group who genuinely looked out for each other. Their friendships felt real. As the show continued, those relationships became shallower and more toxic. Peter would do damaging things to his friends and face no meaningful consequences. When Joe was introduced in Season 1, he was the impressive neighbor everyone admired. Peter was actually jealous of how popular Joe was. Over the years, Joe went from being the man everyone respected to the man everyone mocked, with Peter among the most consistent sources of cruelty toward him. That shift mirrors the larger transformation in who Peter is as a character. The overall effect of Peter's Flanderization on the show cannot be overstated. Peter is the main character, the center around which everything else orbits. When the lead character of a show becomes genuinely unlikable, it damages everything around him. It becomes harder to root for the family when the father is effectively a threat to them. It becomes harder to enjoy the humor when the jokes emerge from cruelty rather than silliness. It becomes harder to care about the story when the central figure has no growth, no self-awareness, and no real consequences for anything he does. The fifth section covers Brian Griffin and his transformation from voice of reason to the most disliked character on the show. If Peter Griffin's decline was like watching a slow car crash that got worse every season, Brian Griffin's decline was like watching your most intelligent friend gradually become the worst person you know. Brian's transformation is arguably the most painful character change in the entire show because of where he started. In the beginning, Brian was the character the audience was meant to relate to most. He was the normal one. He was the person who looked at all the chaos happening around him and responded the way a grounded, reasonable person would respond. He rolled his eyes at Peter's stupidity. He offered thoughtful perspective. He tried to keep things from completely falling apart. He was the heart of the show in a way that no other character was. In the original 3 seasons, Brian was witty, well-read, and carried a dry, sarcastic quality that made him the perfect counterbalance to Peter's loud foolishness. He was Peter's closest friend, and their dynamic was one of the strongest relationships on the program. Beyond being Peter's companion, Brian had his own fully developed inner life. He was a writer who could not finish his novel. He drank a little too much. He had quiet feelings for Lois that surfaced occasionally in ways that were touching rather than uncomfortable. He was unlucky in love. He was insecure about his place in the world. All of these qualities made him feel genuinely human. He had real flaws, but they were balanced by kindness, loyalty, and intellectual honesty. The first major shift in Brian's character came after the show returned from cancellation. In seasons 4 and 5, his political views, which had always been a minor component of who he was, started claiming considerably more space. Brian was liberal, openly atheist, and had strong opinions about social issues. None of that was new, but in the early seasons, those views were one ingredient in a character who had many different sides. After the revival, the writers began using Brian more and more as a vehicle to deliver their own political perspectives directly to the audience. Entire scenes would be devoted to him making speeches about whatever topic the writers wanted to address that week. He moved from a character who happened to have political convictions to a political mouthpiece who happened to be a character. Even viewers who shared his positions found it irritating because it felt less like a person sharing his thoughts and more like the writers breaking through the screen to lecture. But the political soapboxing was just the beginning. The larger problem was what happened to Brian's personality underneath the politics. The smart, thoughtful, loyal dog of the early seasons was gradually replaced by someone who was pretentious, dishonest, and at times genuinely cruel. The Brian of seasons 1 through 3 had actually read the books he talked about. He actually cared about the people around him. The Brian of the later seasons was a fraud who pretended to be an intellectual while having produced almost nothing of actual value, and who claimed moral superiority over everyone around him while behaving worse than most of the people he criticized. The episode that many fans point to as the moment Brian became truly difficult to watch is Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9. In it, Stewie encourages Brian to write again after years of struggle. Brian responds by producing a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which becomes a massive commercial success. Rather than expressing any gratitude to Stewie, who believed in him when nobody else did, Brian transforms into an extraordinarily arrogant character. He treats Stewie, the person who had inspired him, with complete contempt. He belittles him, lashes out at him, behaves as though Stewie is beneath his attention. The episode is difficult to watch because you can still remember who Brian was supposed to be. The list of genuinely troubling things Brian does in the later seasons is startling when reviewed in sequence. He carelessly gave both Chris and Stewie herpes and treated it as a minor inconvenience, despite one of the victims being an infant. He destroyed Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert by chewing it to pieces while drunk, simply because he was tired of Stewie treating it like a real companion. In one episode, Brian encounters a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into the water. He begins to help her. Then he discovers she has a child, meaning she is likely married, and he stops helping. He lets her drown, along with her child, because she was not romantically available to him. The show presents this as a joke. The relationship between Brian and Quagmire became one of the most discussed dynamics on the show during this period. In an episode from Season 8, Quagmire delivers a speech that directly articulates why he cannot stand Brian. He calls him a fraud who performs intellectualism without having actually accomplished anything. He calls him out for consistently making advances toward Lois in front of Peter. He calls out his failed writing career and his insufferable pretensions. He calls out his pattern of abandoning women who care about him. Every single point Quagmire makes is supported by things the show has actually depicted. It is not exaggeration. It is an accurate summary of what Brian has become. What makes this moment so interesting is that the show clearly meant for the audience to agree with Quagmire. The writers knew Brian had become insufferable. They knew the viewers were losing patience with him, so they had Quagmire articulate everything the audience was feeling. But rather than using that moment as a turning point, the show simply continued in the same direction. Brian's behavior escalated. The feud between Brian and Quagmire became a recurring storyline in which Brian was consistently more petty and more dishonest than his supposed antagonist. Then came the storyline that drew the most attention. In Season 12, the episode Life of Brian aired, and in it, Brian is struck by a car and dies. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie was devastated. A replacement dog named Vinny was introduced. The death made national headlines and trended on social media for days. Then, 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and save Brian from being hit. Brian returned. Vinny went back to the pet store. The entire arc was undone in less than a month. Fans and critics widely read this as a calculated ratings stunt. The show had killed off one of its main characters, not because it served any larger story purpose, but because it would generate attention. When Brian returned almost immediately, it confirmed that the death was never meant to carry real weight. Brian was once the character you rooted for. He was the one who felt most like a real person, the one whose struggles you recognized and whose small victories felt meaningful. Watching that character become someone selfish, pretentious, and fundamentally dishonest was not just disappointing. For viewers who had followed the show from the beginning, it felt personal. The 6th section is about Stewie Griffin and the loss of the evil genius. Every great television show has that one character who makes it stand out from everything else on television. The character that people remember even without having watched a full episode. The character that gets quoted and referenced and becomes embedded in the culture beyond the boundaries of the show itself. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that character was Stewie Griffin. He was unlike anything else on television. A baby, barely 1 year old, who spoke with a refined British accent, built advanced weapons in his bedroom, plotted world domination, and spent most of his time trying to murder his own mother. Hilarious, terrifying, original, and completely absurd. The show slowly took all of that away from him. In Season 1, Stewie was the evil genius. That was not a side trait or an occasional joke. It was his entire identity. Nearly every scene with him in that first season involved him either building something dangerous, scheming about domination, or attempting to eliminate Lois. He built weapons. He constructed mind control devices. He spoke with the menacing sophistication of a Bond villain trapped in the body of an infant. The comedy came from the contrast between what he looked like and what he was actually doing, and the writers kept finding new and inventive ways to play with that gap. His obsession with killing Lois was one of the most consistent running elements in those early seasons. Nearly every episode had at least one moment where Stewie attempted to harm her, or at minimum expressed his intentions clearly. Sometimes these were elaborate schemes involving complex machinery. Sometimes they were small, quick moments, Stewie casually mentioning his plans while she was feeding him his dinner. The beauty of the ongoing joke was that Lois never knew. She would pick him up, hug him, and have absolutely no idea that the child in her arms was plotting against her. That dramatic irony, where the audience knows something the character does not, made every interaction between them both funny and slightly tense. Most of the other adults in the show treated Stewie like a normal baby. They heard babbling, not the elaborate speeches the audience could follow. Brian was one of the few who could actually understand Stewie and have genuine conversations with him, which is central to why their friendship eventually became so important. By season 3, the shift was becoming more noticeable. Stewie was still technically evil, still plotting, still attempting to harm Lois. But a softer, more vulnerable side was getting more screen time. He showed more affection toward Brian. He had moments where he seemed less like a cold-hearted villain and more like a genuinely complicated figure trying to understand his own identity. Then, the show returned from cancellation in 2005, and the transformation accelerated. The writers, including MacFarlane, had reached the conclusion that the evil baby concept had been taken as far as it could reasonably go. They felt they had explored every angle of Stewie wanting to kill Lois and conquer the world, and that repeating those same scenarios would make the character feel stale. So they made a deliberate choice to move Stewie in a new direction. The direction they chose was to develop his friendship with Brian into the central pairing on the show, and to explore his emotional interior rather than his villainous schemes. The Road to episodes, special adventure episodes featuring Brian and Stewie traveling together, became some of the most popular in the entire series. These episodes worked because the chemistry between the two was genuinely entertaining. But the trade-off was significant. As Stewie became more of Brian's adventure partner, he became less of the unique and genuinely alarming figure he had been at the start. The world domination plots faded. The attempts to kill Lois disappeared almost entirely. By season 8 and beyond, Stewie was essentially a completely different character wearing the same clothes. The new Stewie was not evil. He was emotional, insecure, and often vulnerable. His storylines shifted from building doomsday devices to navigating personal identity questions and relationship anxieties. The show also began exploring Stewie's sexuality more explicitly in the later seasons. From season 4 onward, Stewie displayed increasingly open cross-gender behavior. He made frequent references and jokes suggesting attraction to men. He went on dates while dressed as a girl. These elements became so dominant in his characterization that for many viewers, Stewie went from being defined by his evil genius to being defined almost entirely by jokes about his gender identity and sexuality. Whether or not this direction was a worthwhile choice for the character, it represented a fundamental departure from what made him irreplaceable. The season 6 two-parter, where Stewie finally kills Lois and then takes over the world, is often identified as the unofficial farewell to the original version of the character. These episodes gave the audience everything they had been waiting to see Stewie achieve since the very beginning. And then the twist arrived. It was all a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. After those episodes, the show never returned to the evil Stewie in any serious way. Those 2 episodes were the final acknowledgement of who the character had once been. The argument that the evil baby joke had been exhausted loses credibility when you consider how many more seasons the show has produced with the replacement version of Stewie. If the writers could find enough material to keep the gentler, more emotionally driven Stewie going for well over 15 seasons, the suggestion that they had run out of ideas for one of the most original character concepts in animation history does not hold up. The evil genius baby was not a joke with a single punchline. It was a concept with essentially limitless directions. New inventions, new schemes, new targets, new allies, new enemies. The possibilities were enormous, and the writers chose to walk away from all of them. The result is that Stewie, while still capable of being entertaining, lost the thing that made him irreplaceable. In the original seasons, every scene with him carried a charge of energy because you never knew what extraordinary thing he was going to say or do next. The current Stewie is pleasant, likable, and safe. For a character built on being the exact opposite of safe, that is the most significant loss of all. The seventh section covers Meg Griffin as the punching bag and the joke that went too far. Every long-running comedy has a character who gets picked on more than everyone else. It is a common setup, and when done well, it can generate real laughs. When done poorly, it just feels mean. When done the way Family Guy did it with Meg Griffin, it goes so far past mean that it becomes something genuinely uncomfortable to experience. The treatment of Meg over the course of this show is not simply a case of a joke going too far. It is a case of a joke replacing an actual character. The writers took a normal, relatable teenage girl and turned her into nothing more than a target. And then they kept hitting that target for over a decade. In the earliest episodes, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert. From season 2 onward, Mila Kunis took over the role. In those first episodes, Meg was a recognizable character. She was Peter and Lois's eldest daughter, a teenager at school, unpopular, without a huge social circle, somewhat overshadowed by her family. The contrast was the joke. When you have a father who is a reckless disaster, a mother holding everything together through sheer will, a socially awkward brother, a secretly evil genius baby, and a talking dog, the ordinary teenager is going to seem comparatively dull. Meg was the normal person in an extraordinary family, and the humor came from how out of place her ordinariness appeared. In those first 3 seasons, the jokes about Meg were mild. Peter would sometimes say something insensitive. Kids at school would make fun of her. She would try to fit in and fail. None of it was vicious. It reflected the kind of thing that genuinely happens to teenagers in large, chaotic families, exaggerated for comedy, but still grounded in something recognizable. Peter was not a great father to Meg, but he was not a predatory one. He ignored her sometimes, said thoughtless things without registering their impact, but there were also moments that showed he cared. The first major shift happened around season 4 after the show returned from cancellation. The jokes about Meg stopped being about her being boring or unpopular and started being about her appearance. Characters began openly commenting on how unattractive she supposedly was. They would react to her presence with visible disgust. This was a significant shift because it moved the comedy from something Meg could theoretically address to something she had no control over. Criticizing a character for being too quiet is one kind of joke. Making her physical appearance the center of sustained ridicule is a considerably crueler kind of joke, and the show committed to it fully. As the seasons continued, the abuse escalated. By the time you reach seasons 8 through 14, the treatment of Meg had become one of the defining features of the entire program. Peter, who in the early seasons was simply an inattentive father, had become actively hostile toward his own daughter. He would insult her for sport. He would physically harm her for entertainment. In one episode, a flashback reveals that Peter and Lois tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was still an infant. The scene is played as a joke. The audience is meant to laugh at the idea of parents wanting to discard their baby daughter. It was not only Peter. The entire family joined in. Lois, who had been the reasonable and caring mother in the early seasons, started treating Meg with open coldness. Chris began participating in the ridicule. Even Stewie directed casual cruelty her way. The entire household became unified around a single activity, and that activity was treating Meg as less than nothing. The show also escalated how the outside world responded to her. Bullying at school became extreme. Strangers insulted her without provocation. The entire town of Quahog seemed to have collectively agreed that Meg Griffin deserved to be treated terribly, and nobody ever questioned this arrangement or attempted to change it. The message being communicated, whether intentionally or not, was that some people simply deserve to be mistreated, and the correct response is to find their suffering funny. The real-world impact of this became strong enough that Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, experienced it personally. People would approach her and repeat the dismissive catchphrase associated with Meg's abuse on the show, directing it at the real woman who gave the character her voice. The fictional cruelty had crossed into reality. The most controversial episode in this entire storyline is the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In it, the Griffin family is trapped inside during a hurricane. Meg, after years of accumulated mistreatment, finally breaks and confronts her family directly. She calls out Peter for being a terrible father. She tells Lois she has been a bad mother. She names the specific ways their treatment of her has damaged her. It is raw, emotionally honest, and for viewers who had been watching Meg get destroyed season after season, it feels like justice. It feels like the show is finally acknowledging that what it has been doing is wrong. But then the episode takes a turn. Without Meg serving as their shared target, the rest of the family begins turning on each other. The family dynamic collapses because they no longer have a communal outlet for their frustrations. And the episode ends with Meg voluntarily withdrawing everything she said and accepting her role as the family's punching bag, because without her absorbing the abuse, the family cannot function. The message of that episode is genuinely troubling. It tells the audience that victims of sustained mistreatment should accept their role because their suffering serves a stabilizing function for the people who are hurting them. It says that standing up for yourself is ultimately selfish because it disrupts the people responsible for the harm. It says the correct response to years of mistreatment is to quietly return to being mistreated so that the people around you do not have to deal with the consequences. Whether or not the writers intended to communicate that message, it is what the episode says. The show has proven multiple times that it knows how to write Meg as an actual character. In The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13, Meg meets Lisa Simpson, who recognizes her talent and encourages her. In the episode about Peter's sister from season 14, the show constructs a genuine explanation for Peter's behavior and allows Meg and Peter to have a real reconciliation. It is emotionally effective, built with care, and suggests that real change might follow. It does not follow. The very next episodes return to the same routine. Peter insults Meg, the family piles on, the abuse continues, as if the reconciliation never occurred. Now, to be fair, the show did eventually pull back. Around season 14 into season 15, the extreme abuse began to decrease. By season 22, it had largely stopped. This change has been partly credited to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the relentless cruelty toward the show's primary female teenager. Meg started getting episodes where she was competent, resilient, and capable of fighting back against the people who had mistreated her. She was allowed to show genuine strength. But the damage had already accumulated. For roughly 10 seasons, from season 4 through season 14, Meg Griffin existed primarily as a vehicle for other characters to demonstrate how little she mattered. She was not a character, she was a punchline, and the punchline never changed. Meg might actually be the most sympathetic and most genuinely human character on the show. She wants to be loved and accepted. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. These are some of the most fundamental desires any person can have, and the show punished her relentlessly for having them. The 8th section is about cutaway gags, and how they went from being the show's greatest strength to its most reliable symbol of creative exhaustion. If you have ever watched even a single episode of Family Guy, you know what a cutaway gag is. A character says something like "This reminds me of the time," and then the screen cuts to a completely separate scene showing some random, usually ridiculous situation. The scene plays out for a few seconds, sometimes longer, and then the show cuts back to the main story. That is the cutaway gag. It is what Family Guy is most famous for. It is the comedy tool that defined the program, made it stand out from everything else on television, and made it one of the most shared shows in the early days of internet video. It is also the thing that, over time, went from being the show's secret weapon to being the clearest sign that the writers had stopped trying. Cutaway gags were part of Family Guy from the very first episode. The format was built into the show's identity from day one. In those first 3 seasons, the cutaways had specific qualities that made them work. They were short, most lasting only a few seconds. They got in, delivered the joke, and got out before the audience lost track of the main story. They were genuinely clever, with the humor coming from unexpected connections and sharp writing. And most importantly, they were not the only source of comedy in the episode. The main story was funny on its own. The character interactions were funny. The dialogue was funny. The cutaways were an addition to a foundation that already worked. You could have removed every cutaway from a season 1 episode and still had a well-written, entertaining program. This is the quality that changed as the seasons went on. Starting with the revival in season 4 and becoming more pronounced through seasons 5, 6, 7, and beyond, the cutaways began to dominate. They got longer, they got more frequent, and most critically, they started to replace actual storytelling rather than supplement it. Instead of functioning as a bonus on top of a solid plot, the plot began to exist solely to connect one cutaway to the next. Episodes started feeling less like stories and more like loosely assembled collections of random sketches tied together by whatever the characters happened to be doing that week. A typical later season episode followed a consistent structure. A brief scene would establish a setup, someone would deliver a reference line, the show would cut to an unrelated gag, the gag would play out, the show would return. Another brief scene, another reference, another cutaway. Over and over again for the entire episode. Some later episodes contained so many cutaways that if you removed all of them, you would have perhaps 10 minutes of actual narrative in a 22-minute program. The cutaways were no longer supporting the story. They had become the story. And that is a significant problem, because cutaways by definition have nothing to do with what is happening in the main plot. They are disconnected and random. When they take over an episode, the plot and the characters suffer. South Park addressed this directly in their 2-part episode Cartoon Wars from 2006. In those episodes, creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's writing process as being carried out by manatees randomly combining idea balls, suggesting that the comedy required no genuine creative thought because any cutaway could be swapped with any other, and nothing would change. Parker and Stone were open about their feelings toward Family Guy, and Parker later revealed that after those episodes aired, they received communications from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill, thanking them for making the point. The criticism, whether motivated by genuine creative disagreement or by rivalry, pointed to something real, particularly as the later seasons continued to prove it. One of the most notorious examples of cutaway excess in the show's history is the Conway Twitty gag. This was a recurring bit where, instead of an actual joke, the show would simply cut to an extended, unedited performance of country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. Not a brief clip, not a quick reference. A full performance that ran for an extended stretch while the audience waited for it to end. There was no punchline. There was no twist. The gag was simply that the show was playing a song instead of doing comedy. Some viewers found it funny the first time due to sheer unexpectedness. By the 3rd and 4th appearances, it was widely seen as one of the laziest things ever put on television. It became symbolic of a show that was filling time rather than creating content. The cutaway problem was made worse by the parallel trend of dragging jokes past the point where they had any remaining value. In the early seasons, if a physical gag appeared, it would last a few seconds, make its point, and move on. In the later seasons, the writers began stretching moments out uncomfortably. A scene that should have lasted 5 seconds would run for 30 or 40, with the same beat repeating itself. The idea appeared to be that extending a joke long enough would generate a second wave of comedy through sheer absurdity. Sometimes this worked. More often, it simply made the episode feel padded. The show was aware that its reliance on cutaways had become a topic of criticism, and it responded by making jokes about the fact. In the episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode, where they observe the characters standing around awkwardly with nothing to do during a cutaway, simply waiting for it to finish. The joke is that characters have nothing to do during these gags except exist in suspension. It is a funny meta moment. It also accidentally makes the exact point the show's critics had been making for years. The most persuasive evidence that Family Guy does not need cutaways to be compelling is the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie. In that episode, the two characters get locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode talking to each other. There are no cutaways. There are no random gags. It is two characters having real, sometimes painful conversations about their lives, their friendship, and their deepest fears. Brian reveals that he keeps a firearm in a safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his life. Stewie reveals the depth of what Brian means to him. The episode is raw, emotionally genuine, and completely unlike anything else the show has produced. And it demonstrates that the program does not need its signature tool. It just needs strong writing and well-developed characters. But episodes like that are the exception. The vast majority of later seasons lean so heavily on cutaways that the story becomes almost incidental. When a show becomes primarily a delivery mechanism for disconnected random jokes, there is less time for everything else. Less time for meaningful character interactions. Less time for the family to demonstrate, through their behavior, that they genuinely care about each other. The warmth that characterized the early seasons, the sense that the Griffins were a real family despite their chaos, cannot survive in a program that spends half its runtime cutting away to unrelated gags. The cutaways did not just replace the comedy, they replaced the heart. The 9th section is about Seth MacFarlane stepping back from the show he created. There is a pattern that recurs throughout television history. A creative person builds something exceptional. They guide it through its foundational years when every decision matters and every detail requires their personal attention. The show becomes successful. Other opportunities emerge. Gradually, bit by bit, the creator steps away from the daily work. They remain attached in name. They still receive credit. The day-to-day decisions, the writing, the story choices, the creative direction, all of that gets handed to other people. And the show begins to change in directions the creator might never have chosen if they had remained actively engaged. This is precisely what happened with Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy, and it is one of the primary reasons the show declined. In the early years, MacFarlane was everywhere in the production. He was not simply the creator and the voice of 4 main characters. He was deeply involved in the writing, the animation choices, and the overall creative vision of the program. When you watch a Season 1 or Season 2 episode, you are watching something that passed through MacFarlane's hands at every stage. He had opinions about the jokes. He had opinions about the character behavior. He had opinions about what the show should feel like and what it should mean. That level of personal investment is what gave the early seasons their distinct identity. Around 2011, MacFarlane made the decision to step away from an active creative role on Family Guy. He did not leave the show entirely. He continued voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, which meant he remained in the recording studio for every episode. But the writing, the story development, and the creative oversight were handed to other people. Show-running responsibilities moved primarily to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over the day-to-day management, while MacFarlane directed his energy elsewhere. And there was a great deal of elsewhere to direct it toward. MacFarlane had become one of the most prominent figures in entertainment and had ambitions that extended well beyond animated television. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the 2012 film Ted, which earned over $500 million worldwide. He followed it with a 2014 Western comedy called A Million Ways to Die in the West. He created and starred in the science fiction series The Orville, which premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. He produced a live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock. He was also a recording artist who had released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. MacFarlane was among the busiest people in Hollywood, and Family Guy was one item on a very long list. There is nothing wrong with a creative person pursuing new projects. MacFarlane had every right to explore other opportunities, but the impact on Family Guy was undeniable. When the creator of a show steps away from the creative process, the program loses the one person who understood it more thoroughly than anyone else. MacFarlane knew why the early seasons worked. He knew the right balance between heart and humor. He knew how far to push the characters before pulling back. He knew when a joke crossed from funny into something else. Without him making those judgments, the show drifted. The people who inherited the creative leadership were experienced professionals. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin had both been with the program for years and understood the world of Family Guy thoroughly. But there is a real difference between knowing a show and having been the person who conceived it. A showrunner who inherited the program will make different choices than the person who built it from nothing. They might push the humor into directions the creator would not have chosen. They might allow character changes to go further than the creator would have permitted. They might not have the same instinct for exactly where a particular choice crosses a line. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox also became a complicating factor. He is openly politically liberal and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his association with a network that shared a corporate family with Fox News. In 2021, he posted publicly on social media that a Fox News host's commentary made him wish Family Guy aired on any other network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. This was not private frustration. This was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows publicly stating that he wanted out. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a substantial deal with NBC Universal, moving his production company away from the Fox ecosystem and into the Comcast family of networks. His newer projects were being developed for platforms that had no connection to Fox. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere, and Family Guy was the obligation keeping him tied to a network he no longer wanted to be associated with. This created an unusual situation. The show's creator did not want it on the network where it aired. He was obligated to voice the characters, but was not steering the creative direction. He had publicly expressed his desire to be somewhere else, and the program kept going season after season because it was financially efficient to produce and continued generating sufficient revenue to justify its existence. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview in which he discussed Family Guy's future. He said he did not see a compelling reason to stop making it because people still valued it. It made audiences happy, and it helped fund causes he cared about. He acknowledged there had been a period when he thought it might be time to conclude the show, but said it had reached what he described as escape velocity, meaning it had been running long enough that there was no obvious reason to end it as long as audiences kept watching. He framed the show's continuation in terms of financial utility and audience demand, rather than creative passion. There was no discussion of new stories he was eager to tell, or creative territories he wanted to explore. That framing tells you something important about where the show was in 2024 compared to 1998, when a young animator pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox with genuine enthusiasm about the characters he had created and the world he wanted to build. The MacFarlane of 2024 saw Family Guy primarily as a reliable financial mechanism that could serve good purposes. That is a reasonable position after 25 years. But it explains a great deal about why the show feels the way it does in its later seasons. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons in a deal with parent company Disney. This would take the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season. coinciding with its 30th anniversary. Family Guy was not just surviving, it was being locked in for years, regardless of whether the creative quality justified the continuation. The 10th section addresses the shift from smart writing to shock value. There is an important distinction between dark humor and shock value. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable or taboo and finds a way to generate genuine comedy through clever writing, unexpected angles, and sharp observation. Shock value simply presents something extreme and waits for the extremeness to produce a reaction. In the early seasons of Family Guy, the show understood this distinction and consistently stayed on the right side of it. The jokes were dark, but they were well crafted. There was thought behind them. By the later seasons, that thought had largely disappeared. The show stopped trying to be clever about its dark humor and started simply trying to be as extreme as possible, apparently assuming that being shocking and being funny were the same thing. In seasons 1 through 3, Family Guy pushed boundaries. It made jokes about religion, politics, race, disability, and other sensitive areas. It was provocative. But the provocative content served the comedy. The jokes were making a point, satirizing something, using the offense as the delivery mechanism for a genuinely funny punchline. The discomfort was a means to an end, not the end itself. Compare that to the later seasons, where the show began relying on graphic violence as a primary source of humor. The violence in the early seasons was cartoonish and exaggerated in the standard animated comedy tradition. Characters got hurt in silly ways and were fine immediately afterward. That is the nature of cartoon violence, and nobody found it troubling because it was never meant to be taken seriously. But starting around season 8 and intensifying as the years went on, the violence became considerably more graphic and considerably more unsettling. The show started depicting injuries in detail that went well past cartoon slapstick and into territory that seemed designed to generate discomfort rather than laughter. Characters appeared with wounds drawn with enough specificity to make the experience unpleasant to watch. The gross-out humor followed the same pattern. In the early seasons, the show might include a quick, unsavory moment as a minor component of a larger joke. In the later seasons, the unsavory moment frequently was the entire joke. The writers appeared to believe that making the audience uncomfortable enough would somehow translate into laughter. Sometimes it did. Most of the time, it simply made people want to look at something else. The political commentary hardened and narrowed. Family Guy had always included political humor, but in the early seasons, it was relatively balanced and prioritized being funny above making a particular argument. In the later seasons, the political content became heavier, more obviously one-sided, and more likely to feel time-stamped almost immediately. Episodes built around specific political figures or particular current events from the moment of their creation aged badly because the jokes were so tightly bound to that specific moment. A great joke remains funny 10 years after it was written. A joke built around a particular politician's specific scandal from a specific year in a specific news cycle does not. The show's use of fourth wall breaking also intensified significantly in the later seasons. In the early episodes, characters acknowledging that they were on a television program was a rare and carefully deployed tool. In the later seasons, it happened constantly. Peter would address the audience directly. Characters would make jokes referencing the program's own declining quality. They would comment on Fox, on the writing staff, on the fact that the show had been running far too long. Some viewers found this self-awareness entertaining. Others reasonably observed that acknowledging a problem and doing something about it are entirely different things. A show that jokes about its own mediocrity has not transcended that mediocrity. It has simply added a layer of commentary on top of it. The overall effect of trading wit for shock was that Family Guy lost its identity as a comedy program and became more of a spectacle. People did not tune in to see what clever direction the writers would take things next. They tuned in to see what outrageous thing the show would do this week. And there is a ceiling on that kind of entertainment. Shock wears off. The first time you see something extreme, it generates a reaction. The 10th time, you are desensitized. The 100th time, you are bored. A show built on cleverness can surprise you indefinitely because there are essentially infinite ways to be clever. A show built on shock will eventually exhaust every escalation available to it and have nowhere left to go. The 11th section covers the ratings decline and numbers that cannot be disputed. You can argue about whether a show is still funny. You can debate whether the characters are better or worse than they were. You can disagree about cutaway gags and shock value and writing quality. These are matters of opinion, and opinions will always differ. But ratings are not opinions. They are recorded facts. They tell you with precision how many people are choosing to watch a program at any given time. And the ratings history of Family Guy tells a story that cannot be spun positively. When Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, the first episode drew around 22 million viewers. Any show airing after the Super Bowl will receive an inflated audience from the carryover effect, so that number should be understood in that context. But even after the initial spike settled, the show held strong. The first season averaged 12.8 million households tuning in, enough to rank it at 33rd overall in the Nielsen ratings for that year. For a brand new animated show, those were genuinely solid numbers. After the show returned from cancellation in 2005, riding significant hype from Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales, Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was an impressive return for a program that had been off the air for 3 years. But from that point, the decline began. It was gradual. Season after season, the average viewership moved downward. The drop was slow enough that in any given year, there was an available explanation: tougher competition, audience fragmentation, streaming alternatives. There was always a reason. But when you step back and observe the trend over many years, the pattern is unmistakable and consistent. By season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, the average viewership had fallen to 5.86 million. That represented a loss of roughly 2 million viewers from season 4's average in under a decade. The decline did not stop there. Season 20 of Family Guy averaged just 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the key adult demographic that advertisers value most. A show that had once returned to television, averaging nearly 8 million viewers, was now barely holding 1.3 million. That is a loss of more than 80% of the audience, and the numbers continued to fall. Season 23 averaged just 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 rating in that same demographic. Less than 750,000 people were watching new episodes of a program that had once been one of the largest on television. The network's treatment of the show reflected this reality. For most of its run, Family Guy occupied Sunday nights as the centerpiece of Fox's animation domination lineup, one of the most prominent positions in American broadcast television. In 2019, the show was moved from its long-established 9 p.m. position to the less prominent 9:30 slot. Then came a more significant shift. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy and Bob's Burgers were removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely, and when Family Guy returned to the schedule, it was placed on Wednesday nights. This was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since 2002, back when the program was in its original troubled run before its first cancellation. Being moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights is understood throughout the television industry as a demotion. It signals that the network no longer views you as a headliner. The irony is that Family Guy once stood at the highest point of critical recognition available to an animated series. In 2009, the show was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated program to receive that nomination since The Flintstones nearly 50 years earlier. Not even The Simpsons had received that honor. In 2013, TV Guide ranked it as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. These achievements speak to a period when Family Guy was taken seriously as a genuine creative force. That period seems very distant now. Despite the collapsing ratings, the show continued to be renewed. In April 2025, a substantial renewal deal with parent company Disney extended the series through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. The show was not just surviving, it was being guaranteed years of additional life regardless of what the numbers said. The explanation is straightforward. Animated shows are dramatically cheaper to produce than live-action programs. There are no expensive sets, no large on-screen casts requiring payment. The voice actors record their lines in a studio. The animation is produced overseas. The entire operation is lean and cost-efficient relative to most of what airs on broadcast television. Beyond its first-run viewership, Family Guy generates income from reruns on cable networks, streaming on Hulu, and a vast merchandise and licensing ecosystem built over 25 years. The money the show produces does not come primarily from how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. It comes from the accumulated infrastructure of a globally recognized brand. Family Guy has become a program that continues to exist, not because it is great, but because it is profitable. The audience that once loved it has largely moved on, and the data establishes that beyond any reasonable dispute. But the business machine keeps operating because the economics continue to function. The show is no longer driven by passion or the desire to produce something exceptional. It is driven by licensing agreements and the fact that it costs very little to keep producing. The 12th and final section covers American Dad and the most uncomfortable evidence of Family Guy's decline. If everything discussed so far represents the internal problems that diminished Family Guy, this section is about the external proof that those problems were real and were not inevitable. Because the single most damaging thing you can say about Family Guy's decline is not that the characters changed, or that the cutaways took over, or that the ratings collapsed. The most damaging thing you can say is that another show created by the same person, launched at the same time, given far less attention and far less cultural momentum, ended up becoming the better program. That show is American Dad, and its existence is the strongest possible evidence that what happened to Family Guy was a choice, not an inevitability. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, a few months before Family Guy returned for its 4th season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane alongside Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed the Smith family, led by Stan Smith, a patriotic conservative CIA agent living in Langley Falls, Virginia, with his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, a space alien named Roger living in their attic, and a German-speaking goldfish named Klaus, who was actually a man whose brain had been transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA. On paper, it sounded like a more peculiar variation on Family Guy, another animated family comedy from the same creator on the same network on the same night. Most people dismissed it immediately as a lesser version of the original thing, and for the first couple of seasons, that criticism was somewhat fair. Early American Dad leaned heavily on Stan's extreme conservatism as its primary source of comedy and felt one-dimensional as a result. The ratings were decent, but unremarkable. Critics were lukewarm. Nobody in 2005 was calling American Dad the better show. But then something happened that nobody anticipated. American Dad got better. Not marginally, not briefly, but significantly and consistently. While Family Guy was going through all the deterioration described throughout this account, American Dad was quietly doing the opposite. It was developing its characters, It was telling stronger stories. It was finding its identity. And it was doing all of this without the massive cultural footprint that Family Guy had spent years building. The central difference between the two shows comes down to one foundational choice. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. Without that tool available, the writers of American Dad had to make every episode function as an actual story. Every joke had to emerge from the characters and the situations they were in. Every funny moment had to be earned through the narrative. This constraint forced the writing staff to develop stronger storytelling instincts, and over time, it produced a program that was simply more satisfying to watch from beginning to end. The characters on American Dad also avoided the kind of wholesale identity collapse that destroyed the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith began as a one-dimensional political caricature, but the writers allowed him to grow into a complex figure who was stubborn and frequently wrong, but also genuinely loved his family and was capable of real change. He had episodes where he was clearly the hero and episodes where he was clearly the problem, and both felt natural because the writers had constructed a character complicated enough to be either. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in all of animated television through a concept with seemingly limitless creative potential. Roger could adopt entirely different personas, becoming different characters with different names, personalities, and backstories. This gave the writers an essentially infinite source of material. Every episode could introduce a new version of Roger, each more absurd than the last, and the concept never went stale because it was designed to perpetually evolve. Compare that to what happened with Stewie, who went from being one of the most original character concepts in animation history to a softer, safer version of himself without any clear replacement for what had been abandoned. Fans and critics noticed the shift over the years. It became a widely acknowledged reality among people who watched both shows that American Dad had surpassed Family Guy in quality. Online discussions, critical rankings, and viewer commentary consistently placed American Dad above its older sibling. People who had grown tired of Family Guy's declining quality found that American Dad was delivering everything they had once valued about McFarlane's comedy, but more consistently and more reliably. The irony of this situation is worth dwelling on. American Dad, the show McFarlane was less closely involved with creatively as the years went on, maintained its quality. Family Guy, the show that carried McFarlane's name most prominently and was supposed to be his defining creation, fell apart. This suggests that the problem with Family Guy was not simply about McFarlane's reduced involvement. It was about the specific creative decisions made by the people running the show in his absence. The American Dad writing staff made choices that protected the show's identity and kept its characters grounded. The Family Guy writing staff made choices that prioritized shock, spectacle, and cutaway gags over character and story. Both shows had the same creator. Both had talented writers. One was managed better than the other, and the results speak clearly. The American Dad comparison eliminates the most common defense of Family Guy's decline. The standard argument is that any show deteriorates after 20 or more years, that creative fatigue is simply inevitable, that no comedy can remain fresh for that long. There is some truth in that as a general principle. But American Dad has been running for roughly the same amount of time and has not suffered the same catastrophic collapse. It demonstrates that longevity alone does not doom a program. What dooms a program is the choices made along the way. Family Guy chose cutaway dependency over storytelling. It chose to erode its characters into unrecognizable versions of themselves rather than develop them while preserving what made them compelling. It chose shock value over cleverness. It continued producing episodes long after the creative momentum that had originally driven it had largely dissipated. None of these things were required. None of them were inevitable. American Dad proves that. At the end of the analysis, Family Guy's decline is not a mystery. It is not some inexplicable phenomenon that happened for no identifiable reason. Every problem the show developed can be traced to specific decisions made by specific people across many seasons. The decision to transform Peter from lovable to cruel. The decision to turn Brian into a pretentious fraud. The decision to retire evil Stewie rather than find new directions for him. The decision to make Meg nothing more than a target for sustained abuse. The decision to let cutaways replace actual stories. The decision to value shock over craft. The decision to keep the show going after the creative energy driving it had been largely exhausted. None of these things had to happen. American Dad is the proof. Family Guy was once one of the most genuinely great animated comedies ever produced. It changed television. It influenced a generation of comedy. It came back from cancellation twice because audiences loved it that much. And then slowly, incrementally, one bad decision at a time, it became the version of itself that people reference as an example of how not to manage a long-running television program. The golden years are still there. Seasons 1 through 3 remain genuinely brilliant. The early revival seasons contain moments of real genius. But the program that airs today, watched by a fraction of its former audience on a night of the week it was never intended to occupy, is a reminder that no amount of past greatness can protect a show from the consequences of present choices. Family Guy did not simply get worse every season. It chose to get worse every season. And that is the part that is hardest to forgive.